To bring a car to market, be it an internal combustion engine one or one powered by electricity, the automaker in question must go through countless hours of vehicle design and engineering. They must iterate through every possible solution to each problem to try and find the one that works best. And then they have to turn their designs into prototypes, then guide successive iterative prototypes through the various stages of pre-production, and finally into production validation. And at every part of that design process, the automaker goes to great lengths to ensure that the vehicle is functioning as designed, that the mechanical components are withstanding all of the stresses and strains they were designed to withstand. And in that final stage, production validation makes sure that the production line is properly set up to make large volumes of the vehicle in question. That includes, of course, making sure that all of the parts are fitted correctly, that the parts themselves do what they are supposed to do, and that all of the welds, connections, and bolts are carried out, made, and tightened to original design specification. Only when production validation has actually been completed does an automaker then start making cars that will end up in customers' hands. And even after production validation has been completed, that last stage of checks that I outlined are usually carried out almost constantly throughout random inspections during the production process, and of course, the final stage of any production vehicle process, the stage of quality control. When the vehicle actually arrives for delivery, there's often also a pre-delivery process that usually includes a quick mechanical inspection from the dealership or store where the vehicle is actually being handed over. And all of this checking is designed to minimize the risk of problems occurring during or after production, and it can save the automaker big bucks in the long term when it comes to remedial work and recalls of everything from cosmetic problems to dangerous faults that pose serious safety threats. But that doesn't mean that everything actually gets caught. And that's why safety organisations around the world, like NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the US, are charged with investigating any issues reported by the general public with their vehicles, as well as working with automakers to officially record any defects and subsequent recalls, as well as enforcing regulations over recall notices and practices, and fining non-compliance for companies that do not follow the practices set out. Which brings us to today, and the news from Inside EVs earlier this week that a couple of Model Y owners are claiming their brand new cars are missing front suspension lower ball joint nuts. The reports are backed up by a thread on the Tesla Motors Club, in which those owners have shared pictures of their car's brand new lower arm control suspension with no nuts. One of the owners had noticed their front wheel was sitting at a weird angle, and upon checking, noticed that there was a nut missing on the said lower ball joint. The second noticed that their car was making strange popping noises and lurching unexpectedly when they turned the steering wheel hard at low speed. They raised concerns with their local Tesla service centre, which in turn said that it could not replicate the problem and it didn't actually check the suspension system because it couldn't detect the noise being complained about. Later, upon checking, that second owner also discovered a missing nut where there should have been one, in exactly the same location. The absence of those nuts, which must be correctly fitted and torqued to ensure that the suspension and steering operates as designed, is most certainly a serious safety issue, and it needs to be addressed immediately in order to prevent potential suspension collapse, failed steering, and everything that those two conditions have the possibility of causing. The thread accompanying these reports is well worth a read, but it also contains some interesting comments from other Tesla owners. There's a split between those who say that owners in question should definitely report the defect to NHTSA immediately, while others are seemingly downplaying it, claiming that loose suspension is a very common problem and effectively is not a big deal. Some have even advised that owners with loose bolts should just go ahead and do them up themselves. Indeed, when I was contemplating writing this script, I discussed it with an online Telegram group I'm part of, and someone repeated that sentiment, going as far as to question why this was even a big news item. This particular video is the result of my thinking on that sentiment, something I've encountered from Tesla owners and fans before, and after discussing this story with many different people, well, this video is the result. In preparing this video, I want you to know that I did a significant amount of research, and in this case I was also aided by my friend Kia, who was unfortunately on leave due to a work-related injury. Thank you, get better soon, hun. I also want to thank friends I've talked to who have Teslas, some of whom have been long-time Tesla drivers and supporters. On this channel, as a matter of course, we always try and report potential safety issues with vehicles, and will notify you when there's an official recall or a stop sale. We also cover accidents or large news stories involving cleaner, greener, safer and smarter vehicles that appear to be caused by a manufacturing defect or a vehicle failure. And when there's a fatality or an accident under investigation, we do not include video or photography from the accident out of respect for those involved. But then we don't include video or photography that we don't have rights clearance to use. Under normal circumstances, when news of a story like this surfaces, this is what would normally happen. First, we'd reach out to the automaker in question, whoever they were, to see if they have a statement to issue. Usually we do that via email. If they do have a statement, we will either put it in the video or note that they responded with something like no comment or we're aware of the report and we're looking into it. If a statement isn't forthcoming, we'll try and look at similar cases. Then we'll look at what we think is the cause and how perhaps we think it could be rectified. To our first point, we did reach out to the automaker in question earlier today, as we do with any large news story like this, and as of filming this, several hours after sending the urgent press request, we've heard nothing from Tesla. Sadly, this is becoming de facto, and both Tesla, as well as some other automakers, now appear to be following a new norm of only engaging with outlets they know will be favourable to them and publish positive news. I don't bring this up in an attempt to grind axes, but rather to let you know that it's becoming increasingly difficult in the automotive industry to get tough questions answered from certain companies. With radio silence from Tesla, and to be clear, if we do hear back from Tesla via email, we will update this video in the description or maybe even make a follow-up video. Let's look at the claim that some have been making that this is a common issue in the automotive industry. Almost that suspension nuts regularly come loose and fall off, and we shouldn't worry about it. On the face of it, suspension faults aren't unheard of. Over the last decade, most major automakers have ended up recalling their cars for some suspension-related fault. Usually it's down to components that are either improperly fitted or not made to spec. For example, Toyota recalled its RAV4 earlier this year due to potential cracks that might appear in its front lower suspension arms. Ford recalled more than 211,000 vehicles this February to fix a potential fractured rear suspension toe link. I could go on, but if you look back over the last 2 years or so, you'll see Peugeot, BMW, Audi, Volkswagen, and pretty much every other automaker recalling vehicles for, quote, suspension faults. In that way, claiming that suspension faults are common and that vehicles regularly have suspension nuts come loose is not completely false, but not completely true. Based on the research that we've done for this video, suspension failures with loose nuts aren't unheard of, but they're also usually, not always, a problem that affect cars older than the Model Ys we're talking about. Either way, any suspension fault like this, even if it's on one car, is dangerous and it needs to be investigated. So what's the likely cause here? Having spoken to people who wish to remain anonymous in the automotive industry, it seems that there are several potential causes. But I should note that I, as everyone else I've spoken to, believes that the problem was not a missing nut at the factory, but one that was maybe not torqued or fitted correctly, and thus has just fallen off as the car has been driven. Assuming it left the factory without the nut is both similarly tough to believe and horrendous in its implications. So I hope that we're right about it falling off post-production because it wasn't tight enough. First, most basically, this could be caused by human error, either someone who isn't doing their job properly when it comes to torquing suspension nuts up, or someone who hasn't been appropriately trained to use the tools that are required for that job. Or it could be someone who is simply overworked and overtired. As with any job, the longer you work, the more mistakes you'll make. The longer you work and the harder you're pushed, the more mistakes you'll make. And missing 1 or 2 cars out of every 100 on a production line may not sound like a big deal, but it kind of is. It could also be a problem with the equipment being used. If it's incorrectly calibrated or set up poorly, it may not be tightening the nut to the correct tension, but reporting that it has. I know the opposite end of this one myself. I actually over-torqued a bolt and snapped it once because I didn't remember to properly calibrate the torque wrench before I started. Another potential is that, in an attempt to make the production process more streamlined, increasing throughput and allowing more vehicles to be made per hour could lead to more mistakes. It could have led to reduced quality control or less time for workers to actually double-check their work before the next car comes along. And then, of course, there's a concept of sabotage, which is not unheard of. Now I've detailed the potential causes, what can we do about the solution? Well, obviously the first thing here is to address the scope of the problem. In Tesla's case, I'm hopeful that it contacts all Model Y owners and offers to check the nuts in question. This would not only give Tesla owners peace of mind, but it would also be a great bit of customer care. It would also be a great way for Tesla to see just how many cars are affected. Concurrently, at the same time, it could examine equipment at the factory on the various Model 3 and Model Y production lines to determine if they're operating to spec or if there's something wrong there. Why do I say this? Well, unfortunately, earlier this year, owners reported the exact same problem on Model 3. And before that, Model 3 owners have reported similar problems with their cars. In fact, there's at least one court case involving a Model 3 owner who sued Tesla for what they claim was a faulty suspension setup causing their wheel to come off. And Model 3 and Model Y are made on the same production line. If we add all of these facts together, the Model 3 and Model Y happen to share the same suspension components, and many other components are put together on the same production line, then I suspect the issue goes back further than Model Y launch. And I hope, although I have no way of knowing because, as I've said, Tesla isn't responding to emails, that Tesla is now working on a solution to rectify all of these issues. Suspension has historically always been one of Tesla's weakest areas when it comes to reliability, so I'm hopeful we'll see this one fixed once and for all. My advice to Model 3 and Model Y owners? Well, I'd suggest you check your suspension yourself, or if you're not sure how to do that, get a knowledgeable friend to do it for you. And if there is a loose nut or no nut, call Tesla. Don't try and fix it yourself. Ultimately, while this is currently only seemingly affecting just 2 cars, that's 2 cars too many. Any fault with manufacturing that could potentially cause accidents, which would be far more damaging to the company's reputation down the line, needs to be investigated and remedied post-haste. One final thing to talk about in this video: those who've watched this and questioned my own issues with suspension on my own car, a 2017 Chevrolet Bolt EV. In the interests of full disclosure, let's revisit that and explain where I am at that point. Earlier this year, before my car reached its 35,000-mile end of warranty period, it started making a creaking noise on certain acceleration, and so I took it to the dealership. They've replaced several components and checked the whole suspension setup, so I am going to trust that everything is tight, and I have looked myself. While we haven't got to the bottom of the issue and it still is creaking occasionally, it's worth noting it appeared after many thousands of miles, and I am regularly checking to make sure it's not doing anything it shouldn't. And yes, it's likely just the bushings making squeaking noises, so far, so good. Do you have a Model 3 or Model Y? What would you like to see happen next in this instance? And have you encountered any suspension issues? Let me know below. That's it for today's video. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our plugged-in Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our self-driving level patrons John Lyons, Regine Fellows and Jeffrey Songster, and our deepest gratitude to our Starman level Patreon supporters Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback and Sean Udea. You can join all of these Patreon supporters yourself by following the links below, and there's also links to make a donation through Ko-fi or Bitcoin. You'll also find a link to our free Discord server, so log in, join the room and have some fun. After the names have scrolled, you'll see a suggestion for a new video to watch from this channel, so please consider watching it if you haven't, and I'll be back very soon. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!